Now that the sheep are gone, if you haven't seen Plandemic...
I think this was all planned by the Democratic Party.
Do you believe the numbers and the news that's being reported by the mainstream news media?
You've been brainwashed.
You cannot escape God, not even with the mask or 6 feet.
He's blowing the lid off the COVID scandal, the scamdemic.
There's not enough to make this a pandemic. This is a planned-demic.
YouTube, all these different companies do not like what you're saying.
And if any of you are in the deep state, you're going down with it.
COVID-19 has taken over our lives, but it hasn't been around for very long. Scientists have been studying it in real time as the world collectively goes through a traumatic, world-changing event.
What we do know is, obviously we know it's a coronavirus. We know that it's a strain that partly came from a bat, but it's mixed with something else. And we haven't nailed down exactly what that animal is.
So on the face of it, that's not very reassuring. It's killed more than 500,000 people, but we don't even know exactly where it came from. As a result, conspiracy theories have spread right alongside the virus. And for companies like Google, Facebook, and Twitter, long-standing questions about how they should handle misinformation on their platforms have never been more relevant. Thousands of years ago, people thought epilepsy was a magical, divinely given disease. But around 400 BCE, the Greek physician Hippocrates, or one of his contemporaries, wrote that epilepsy has a natural cause, and its supposed divine origin is due to men's inexperience and to their wonder at its peculiar character. Men continue to believe in its divine origin because they are at a loss to understand it. And 2,600 years later, we are still dealing with that kind of thinking.
The advantage of saying false things is they don't have to be true. And so you can make them nice, easy, pat stories that are really comforting to believe. And that's what makes it really difficult to fight back against, because you're trying to argue against a really simple, easy to understand story that fits your beliefs versus this much more complicated story that isn't going to give you an easy answer.
In places like Brazil, Venezuela, and the US, while there are some leaders promoting a science-based approach, many politicians and people in power are actively promoting misinformation.
We have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China.
This cycle that we're doing is not stopping anything. It's not preventing the spread.
Locking down doesn't work.
Here's my evidence. I get a lot of positive calls about it.
In a recent study that's now in preprint, Cornell professor of government Sarah Kreps examined how Americans are handling COVID-19 misinformation.
We found that Americans are really bad at correctly identifying fake news as fake. The more you rely on social media for your news, the more likely you are to be prone to this dynamic where you're not only failing to identify fake news as fake, but the factual information as true.
Misinformation has been around forever, but the internet and social media have made it much harder to counter.
What the internet allows it to do is spread really far, really fast, and hit a lot of people. By the time anyone realizes that it's false and has started to debunk it, it's already spread to maybe millions of people.
There is a scientific process for all of our content. This takes a long time, especially with a new virus. In that time, anyone can create a video and put it on YouTube. It takes 5 minutes.
One study done in March showed that over a quarter of the most viewed YouTube videos on COVID-19 contained misleading information.
In general, what we found in a bunch of studies is that most of the people who believe false news stories do so because they're just not thinking deeply about whether what they're reading is true or false.
Healthy people aren't dying. We're just getting over it like the flu.
Do you see this like the flu?
I see it like the flu. That's exactly what it is. It's a different type of flu.
So what are you saying to the scientists and those who encourage you to keep apart and wear a mask?
They're fearmongers because they don't know.
It's a situation where those with opposing views can be baffled by the other side's inability to see what they're seeing.
There's a tendency for us to think that the people who fall for misinformation are other than us. That kind of we're smarter than everyone else. We wouldn't believe anything that's demonstrably false. And we find that that's just not the case. all of us sometimes fall for misinformation.
Every bit of information you absorb is filtered through your worldview and your cultural values. We are fundamentally fallible, easily fooled humans. And positions on especially important things like evolution or vaccinations or COVID-19 can become not just evaluations of truth, but part of your identity.
It may be the case that at first people have no particular allegiance to any given understanding of what's going on. It's all so new and so fluid, but over time, there will be a kind of convergence. And the worry is that those beliefs, sometimes inaccurate ones or even dangerous ones, become linked to people's worldviews or belief systems.
That's the kind of thing that we're seeing on debates like climate change or nuclear power or the HPV vaccine. Positions on those issues have essentially become symbols of people's membership in and loyalty to groups. And the stake that people have in their standing in the group is a very strong one. And in those conditions, people tend to use their reason to extract from information the parts of it that help them to reinforce the beliefs that are held within their group.
In Sarah Krepp's recent Cornell study, Democrats were consistently more likely to correctly identify a COVID-related headline as true or false than were independents or Republicans. But that doesn't mean Democrats are smarter than independents or Republicans. On average, Republicans and Democrats hold similar levels of science knowledge. But it could suggest that the worldviews of Republicans and independents are more closely aligned with this specific kind of misinformation, and as a result are more likely to accept it as true.
In the mid-90s, there was no relationship between which party you identified with and your beliefs about the reality of climate change. Now that it's a very high-stakes issue, it's so closely linked to partisanship and ideology that it's very hard to unwind that relationship.
And right now, things are getting worse. In April, 47% of Republicans believed that the coronavirus had been made a bigger deal than it really is. By June, that had grown to 63%. Among Democrats, it went from 14% to 18%.
Both Facebook and Twitter have been widely criticized for years for allowing health misinformation to flourish. They've stressed for a long time that they don't want to be media companies. They don't want to be in the business of editorial. They don't want to be arbiters of truth. And so now they're being forced to kind of look internally and say, what kind of measures are we willing to take?
In 2019, a Pew Research Center survey showed that 55% of US adults get news from social media often or sometimes. Facebook was the most popular source, followed by YouTube, and then Twitter. Since COVID, all three have launched information portals with up-to-date information about the virus. And if you search Google for a COVID-related term, you get information from places like the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization above the actual search results. Andy Pattison helped make this happen.
When you, at the beginning of the outbreak, were searching for coronavirus or COVID-19 or some 30 or 40 different search terms, you would come up with everything that was on the internet that had been published with regards to that, whether it was true or false. So one of my first calls was to Google search.
The WHO offered to provide accurate COVID-19 information to Google that the company could then deploy as necessary.
And now what you'll get is when you do go to google.com and do a search for coronavirus or the 30 related terms, you will get what we call a knowledge panel.
YouTube also worked with the WHO.
They are able to give us insights into the highest rising trends of content around COVID. So they could look at conspiracy theories and say, hey, watch out, there's a conspiracy theory brewing at the moment about this. So we can debunk that myth. This is the kind of stepping up that I hope to see in other companies. The response we've had from YouTube has been fantastic.
Facebook and Twitter have similar information panels in place. If you search for a COVID conspiracy theory, you get a panel or links to accurate information from places like the CDC or WHO. Beyond that, here's what Facebook and Twitter are doing. Anything that gets posted is reviewed by humans and algorithms, and problematic posts get sorted into categories. Some things get removed. For Facebook, those are things that pose a risk of leading to imminent physical danger. For Twitter, it's severe statements or assertions that have been confirmed to be false or misleading by subject matter experts. Some things don't get removed, but instead they're labeled or their distribution is reduced. For Facebook, this includes claims that don't result in direct physical harm, but have still been deemed false. So a conspiracy theory about the origin of the virus might not get removed, but it would get labeled as misinformation, and anyone who previously shared it would get notified and shown links to COVID myths debunked by the WHO.
With Facebook, by giving them content which was saying, this is definitely true, this is definitely true, this is definitely false, we became the judge and they were able to remove content very quickly. This was very important for us because a lot of the myths and falsehoods which are on the internet actually could cause harm. A perfect example of that was that in the Middle East, there was a rumor going around that high-grade alcohol would kill the virus. And nearly 800 people died in Iran from ingesting high percent alcohol. So it's really important that this information is removed immediately.
But one problem is that what kind of post falls into each category isn't always clear.
They say that they have these policies that they'll enforce, but these are policies that are pretty frequently broken, some would say by the president himself. And so when exactly Facebook enforces it, it seems like it's kind of a moving line.
Twitter mostly focuses on labeling things. Moderate statements or assertions that have been confirmed to be false or misleading by subject matter experts or disputed claims are labeled as such.
What the platforms seem to be doing is treating COVID-19 misinformation as another category of speech that needs to be aggressively policed. So it's not in the bucket with standard political fact checking where we wait for a fact check to emerge on this particular piece of content. They're policing it more aggressively to not just reduce the reach of that content in terms of how high it is in your newsfeed, but whether it's even on platform at all.
Facebook says that during the month of March, it displayed warnings on about 40 million posts related to COVID-19, and that when people saw those warning labels, 95% of the time they did not go on to view the original content. The company also says that it has removed hundreds of thousands of pieces of misinformation that could lead to imminent physical harm, like claims that drinking bleach cures the virus or theories that physical distancing is ineffective. But one area Facebook has not done as much is in its groups.
So these tend to be more private groups where people are just sharing content with each other, and oftentimes all sorts of conspiracy theories are coming up about the origin of the virus. Facebook has done far less to combat misinformation in these groups.
For a while, they got away with this, but now that Facebook advertisers are starting to say that they don't want their content running alongside those types of content, now it seems like it is finally a problem for them.
The recent Facebook ad boycott began as a result of criticism of the company's handling of misinformation and hate speech, and it's no longer just an intellectual argument for these companies and their leadership. While most of the US was struggling with the consequences of COVID-19, from March 16 to June 23, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg's net worth grew by almost $36 billion. But after the ad boycott, Facebook shares went down, and he lost almost $10 billion in 4 days.
These are, multi-million budget advertisers that are taking their money and their business elsewhere. And I would assume that some of that business is going to Facebook's rivals.
So huge amounts of money are now involved, and these companies are being forced to rethink how they handle misinformation.
It wasn't too long ago that Twitter was pretty much seen by anyone paying attention to social media as the free speech wing of social networks. And in very recent years, the thinking and the reputation that Twitter had in comparison to Facebook really flipped. And this was something that Facebook, and in particular CEO Mark Zuckerberg, really hopped on. And they picked up that torch and started to proclaim that Facebook was the free speech social network.
For Twitter, its many fewer users means the company has a much smaller pool of misinformation to sort through. Facebook has 1.73 billion daily active users. Twitter has 166 million.
So even if they bring down, let's say 99% of it, they're still leaving up, let's say 1 million posts, or people are exposed to a lot of misinformation despite their best efforts.
Twitter says that since introducing its new misinformation policies on March 18, it has removed 14,900 tweets, which means that for about every 4 million tweets posted, one tweet was removed. The company says that it will not be able to label or take action on every tweet that contains misinformation, and is prioritizing the most harmful content. One example of the resulting ambiguity is a tweet from President Trump's former campaign manager Brad Parscale. He linked to an article about the benefits of hydroxychloroquine from the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, an organization that has in the past promoted debunked claims like the idea that HIV does not cause AIDS, that the gay male lifestyle shortens life expectancy by 20 years, and possible links between autism and vaccinations. These things and his recent tweet are not factual. But Twitter hasn't removed or labeled Parscale's tweet as misinformation, and when asked about it, the company said that it's because wishes or hopes of cures do not increase people's likelihood of coming into harm, but directing people to act or do something that could harm them would. At the same time, Twitter has been seen as recently having taken stronger action than Facebook after its decision to label several of President Trump's tweets when Facebook did not. But it's clear that both companies are still struggling with misinformation.
While Twitter has been trying to flag and label some of this information, at times, I think that they've just been overwhelmed by it and they have not reacted quickly enough.
But there are reasons to be cautiously optimistic.
We've always been fighting misinformation around health, and we've been working with the tech industry for a couple of years now to fight these things. But I think that the global pandemic has sort of created this awareness of how bad and terrible it can be, because it impacts each and every one of us. In the past, it impacted other people. Now it's impacting every one of us. So we have to start thinking more maturely about this content and take it a lot more seriously.
While there certainly are examples of health misinformation, related to COVID-19 circulating on the platforms, their reach seems to be much more limited than we might have feared based on prior experience going into this. So while we need to remain vigilant, I would actually say that I'm much more worried about mainstream media actors who are denying the severity of the crisis for far too long than I am social media, although there's certainly bad examples there too.
Alongside all of this, questions about free speech and the First Amendment are rightfully being discussed.
Taking down what's clearly misinformation about COVID is in the service of public health, and they do need to be engaging in those kinds of content moderation behaviors. What I think is potentially worrisome is if then that spills over into moderating on politics.
I don't endorse this approach when it comes to all political speech. But when it comes to health misinformation that can endanger people's lives, that is not just normal political speech, I think it's appropriate to take a more strict perspective.
It's hard to convince someone that they're wrong about something, so it's important to get accurate information out there in the first place.
We can play whack-a-mole all day with the various myths that are out there, but we need to be reinforcing over and over again those important messages about washing your hands and social distancing and all the other things that are going to help us get through this epidemic.
And don't completely give up on trying to convince your friends and family to rethink harmful false beliefs.
I want to open up our beaches. I think the beaches are safe.
Interpersonal social context is a powerful one in which minds can be opened. People's beliefs can be changed. We often give up on those notions, but I think we shouldn't, especially now. And in your social network, you can be a quite powerful voice.
And continuing to work to increase the scientific literacy and critical thinking skills of everyone is crucial.
There's no one quick method of knowing what's real and what's not real on social media or in the news. If something's important enough for you to decide whether or not you believe it, then you need to invest a little bit of time.
Basically, anything you can do to get people to slow down, to actually read the article, to think about whether what they're sharing is true is going to help a lot.
You just have to realize that if you're going to guess, and with the absence of reliable information, you are just stating your bias.
We have to get out of this habit of just sharing because it sounds extraordinary. We have to think about, what are the sources of this information? Do I trust this source? Should I check the facts? And who am I going to check it with before I share?
So getting away from political and sports reporters who got thrown on the story, getting away from this guy told me this thing, and getting closer, even, getting away from the TV doctors and getting closer to the real subject matter experts. If you want to drill down, those are the people you want to be learning from, not some guy who puts some post up on Medium and tells you he knows what's going on.